Hello and welcome. Today we're going to talk about addiction science. First, I want to get really clear on the difference between substance use and addiction. So, substance use is the occasional or recreational use of substances, and normally it doesn't lead to addiction or significant harm. Addiction is the compulsive use of substances despite negative consequences. It's normally characterized by a loss of control and intense cravings. We're going to start with a video on the science of addiction and the brain.
Described as a global humanitarian crisis. It affects millions of people around the world, has been the subject of numerous media depictions, and is potentially one of the most stigmatized conditions that there is. What happens neurologically when we actually become addicted to something? Scientists first began to seriously study addictive behaviors back in the 1930s. Before this, it was widely assumed that people with addictions were in some way morally flawed or lacking the willpower and mental strength to overcome their problems. It's a story we've all come across. The diligent students start skipping school and letting their grades slip. A trustworthy, honest friend might get caught stealing. The immaculate beauty queen stops caring about their appearance. These out-of-character behavioral changes can be directly linked to changes within the brain itself. In this video, we're going to delve deep into the science behind addiction. But first, let's talk exactly about what is an addiction. According to the NHS, addiction can be defined as not having control over doing, taking, or using something in a way where it could be harmful to you. This is most commonly associated with drug abuse, but the definition can be extended to include just about anything. Gambling, sex, or even work can lead to harmful, destructive addictions, with the affected people causing themselves, as well as the people around them, harm by neglecting all other aspects of their lives. Innovative brain imaging techniques have revolutionized our understanding of what is happening to the brains of affected people. We can now see that addiction actually changes the brain structure in ways that can alter the way it works and process information. To understand the ways that this might impact their choices and behavior, we need to start thinking about rewards. Deep in the brain sits the reward pathway, a neuronal pathway that connects clusters of neurons from different areas of the brain in a highly organized way. Also known as the mesolimbic pathway, the reward pathway's primary function is to reinforce sets of behaviors. If we think back in evolutionary time, it was helpful to have a mechanism that rewards us for behaviors useful for survival. Things like finding food in times of famine, or escaping from a source of danger. It's even more helpful to have a way to remember how we managed to stay alive, so that we can repeat it the next time we're in a similar situation. The reward pathway achieves all this primarily through the use of a particular neurotransmitter called dopamine. Following an appropriate action, a small burst of dopamine is released by the reward pathway. This causes you to feel a small jolt of satisfaction, which acts as a reward for keeping yourself alive, encouraging you to repeat the same behavior in the future. Dopamine signals also act on areas of the brain involved in memory and movement, which help us build up memories of what is good for survival and makes it easier to do it again. Dopamine is also released when good things happen to us. Rewarding experiences such as winning a game or getting a compliment at work send signals to release bursts of dopamine. More indirectly, if you take a painkiller like an opioid or have an alcoholic drink, certain neurons within your central nervous system are suppressed. The resulting feelings of peace or relaxation also come about through a spike in dopamine release. This, unfortunately, paves the way for both drug and non-drug addictions. Whenever an action or a substance is abused, such as excessive gambling or overconsumption of pornography, junk food, or drugs, the reward system floods the entire circuit with levels of dopamine up to 10 times higher than a natural reward. Depending on the route of administration, this can happen almost instantaneously, with the effects lasting much longer than a natural stimulus. The overstimulation of the brain's natural reward mechanism produces intensely euphoric and pleasurable sensations that act to strongly motivate people to seek out more of it. Unfortunately, if we keep on taking and engaging in these behaviors and flooding our reward systems, over time, the brain attempts to adapt to these chronically elevated levels of dopamine. The brain actually reduces the number of receptors that are able to respond to dopamine signals, with special channels being inserted to remove dopamine from the circuit. It also means that dopamine release is reduced as well. With your ability to feel pleasure now drastically reduced, you experience tolerance, a state where you need to experience more and more of this substance or action in order to release the same amount of dopamine. This explains the predominant seeking behaviors commonly seen in long-term addiction. Eventually, areas outside of the reward pathways are affected too. Brain regions involved in decision-making, judgment, and even memory begin to physically change, with some areas having neurons added and some areas dying away. The overall effect is to make drug-seeking behavior become driven by habit rather than conscious thought, almost like a reflex. In effect, that person's brain has become hijacked, concentrated on the sole purpose of seeking out more and more of the addictive substance, whatever the cost. Not everyone who tries a drug will become an addict. So why do some people develop strong addictions while others don't? We can split the answer into three main reasons: genetics, environment, and development. You've probably come across someone describing themselves as having an addictive personality. In fact, recent research suggests that up to 75% of the likelihood of developing addiction comes from your genetics. These biological differences can make a person more or less vulnerable to addiction and can influence the strength of any withdrawal symptoms experienced if they attempt to quit. Addiction is quite clearly a complex trait and is most likely influenced by multiple different genes. No one is born destined to develop an addiction. So what else is at work here? The next point is the social environment, and that plays a significant role in rewiring of your reward system. For example, if you've got a stable relationship or doing great at work, you're going to feel pretty good. It's thought that people who don't have much stimulation of their reward pathways through social environment or interactions are more likely to seek out addictive activities as a way to stimulate their own neglected reward pathways. One study found that monkeys lower down on the social hierarchy who didn't receive as many social benefits, such as grooming, were much more likely to self-administer cocaine in a laboratory than monkeys higher up in the social ladder. Now comes the last point: development. We know that addiction can happen at any age, but we also know that the earlier in life someone tries drugs, the more likely it is that they will develop an addiction. The brain doesn't finish developing until your mid-20s. In particular, an area that continues to mature during adolescence is the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for reasoning, keeping your emotions under control, and making decisions. We all know how rebellious teenagers are, wanting to go out at odd hours, try new things, fight back against what they perceive to be parental or social tyranny as they try to find themselves. Unfortunately, this means that the adolescent brain is hardwired for taking risks and making poor decisions. This extends to things like trying drugs or continuing to take them, which is why intervention in this group is especially important to prevent lifelong problems. No one chooses how their brain is going to react, and there is no single factor that determines whether a person will become addicted or not. Nonetheless, it's a real problem that millions of people face every day. These videos are made possible by our Patreon supporters. You can support us by using the link below, and don't forget to drop us a like if you.
This video overviews some very, very important points in addiction science, and they will be points that we review throughout this whole training. So, what I will like to start with is what are the causes of addiction? The video went over the genetics, that there is an inherent risk that significantly increases the likelihood of addiction development in our genes. Mental health conditions like depression and anxiety can also heighten the susceptibility. Also, the psychological factors of trauma and stress. So, early trauma impacts emotional regulation, which can lead to coping with substances and behaviors to manage emotional pain. Also, personality traits like impulsivity and sensation seeking raise the risk. There can also be environmental factors, which the video went over, social influence. So if people around you are using drugs and it's normal, there's an increased risk for you to use. Peer pressure is definitely a significant factor, especially among adolescents. Accessibility. So if drugs are nearby and they're easy to access, this raises the likelihood of addiction. Also, socioeconomic stress. Higher rates of addiction are seen in poverty, and resource scarcity also contributes to that. So let's look at addiction as a brain disease. So there are structural changes that happen when we are looking at addiction. The addiction alters the brain structure. It impairs areas responsible for decision making and impulse control. The video went over this, but the basic idea is that when the reward system is hijacked, um, the front part of your brain, the prefrontal cortex, gets used less. So then there aren't as much impulses going to that part of the brain, and it can actually allow parts of that part of that brain to die out. This video also talked a lot about dopamine. So there's a large system impact from high rates of dopamine release, which is the brain's reward system. And as the video stated, the brain's reward system does get hijacked due to the overproduction of dopamine. And this often leads to intense cravings and compulsive drug seeking behavior to try and fill that need. There is also a chronic nature when we look at addiction. So, ongoing care is often needed. Addiction can return even after stopping, and it gets progressively worse and requires continuous support to manage and it impacts both health and daily life. So, when we look at the brain and we really look at how addiction impacts the brain, we talked about the reward pathway and how it gets hijacked. We looked at the prefrontal cortex, the front of the brain. Also, I want to talk a little bit about the amygdala. It becomes overactive, which is this mid part of your brain, and it increases the sensitivity and relapse risk. The hippocampus, which is this blue and purple part above this picture, it strengthens associations between substance behaviors and environmental cues, creating powerful triggers. And then there's also gray matter reduction. So when you use drugs, your gray matter becomes less, and this further impairs behavioral regulation. I'm going to talk a little bit about the brain reward system. So this is how it works. There's a rewarding behavior. You do something like eating, social interaction, gambling, something that causes the brain to find reward. And then dopamine's released. So the dopamine is a neurotransmitter associated with pleasure and motivation. So what happens is this dopamine release reinforces the rewarding behavior, making it more likely to be repeated. And that's how the brain's reward system works. Rewarding behavior, dopamine release, and then the reinforcement from the dopamine release. So how does the reward pathway hijacking work? Well, the video talked about this. I'm just going to talk about it a little bit more. So what happens is a dopamine overload. So drug use floods the brain with dopamine, creating an artificial surge of pleasure and activating the brain's reward system. So then the brain adapts. With repeated use, the brain's chemistry adjusts to the dopamine overload, leading to dependence as it begins to rely on the substance to function normally. And then the reward system gets hijacked. So over time, substance use alters the brain's reward system pathways, resulting in intense cravings for the addictive behavior or substance to get the dopamine overload. And this creates dependency. All right, we are going to watch a video on addiction.
Addiction 911, disease model of addiction. After watching this video, you will be able to explain how addiction fits into a disease model, compare dopamine released as a result of drugs to sex or food, and describe how the brain changes in a person dependent on drugs. When you hear the word addiction, what comes to mind? Most people, when they hear the word addiction, think about the worst aspects of the problem, the behaviors that are easily seen by others. What we don't see, and what people don't often think about, is that addiction is a disease that is extremely stigmatized. Many people think that if someone wanted, they could just stop using. In reality, especially for substances that cause physical dependence, such as opioids, benzodiazepines, and alcohol, changing use patterns is extremely challenging because of what's going on inside the person. Deep inside our brain lives our pleasure center. Lots of things can activate our pleasure center: food, exercise, sex, and substances, to name a few. Let's take food, for example. When we eat a food we like, chemicals from the food travel to the pleasure center part of our brain and attach to brain receptors, which creates dopamine, the feel-good chemical. Now, if we think of our pleasure center as a feel-good tank, when we eat food, our feel-good tank increases a little. Substances, like food, also cause the creation of dopamine. Unlike with food, though, substances cause the feel-good tank to overflow. Over time, because of substances, those normal, everyday pleasure center activators are less effective at increasing our feel-good tank, and over time, they result in barely any pleasure at all. With more time, these substances become the only way that a person can activate the pleasure center, although the level of activation decreases over time. Eventually, extended use leads to even substances not activating the pleasure center. Instead, the substance becomes necessary to keep the person from feeling really, really bad. The brain becomes dependent on the substance, which is why substance use disorders are considered a disease. You're probably still wondering about those bad things we see with addiction: crime, irresponsibility, lack of respect for others. How does that fit into the disease model of addiction? Because our brain is trying desperately to not feel bad, it develops tunnel vision on obtaining a substance, no matter what. It's a compulsion. It has to be obtained. Feeling bad must be avoided. The brain loses sight of things like values, responsibilities, and laws. Its sole focus is to not feel bad. Does this mean that people with addiction should be free to do whatever they have to feel better? No. What this means is that we can't shame someone into ceasing their use, because what may have started with a first-time choice turns into an all-encompassing disease and dependence.
Okay, so this video really goes over what addiction is as far as the disease model. So what we're going to talk about now is a little bit more about what addiction is. So addiction is a relapsing disorder characterized by compulsive use, which is that uncontrollable urge he talked about to engage in a behavior or substance use that results in harmful consequences. And then there's this sense of loss of control. It's this inability to stop, even when one tries. There's changes in the brain. These are these long-term alterations in brain structure that we talked about. And they really are related to reward, motivation, memory, and self-control. Negative impact is also a big one. So if there's significant interference with daily life, including relationships, health, work, or education, this is also a characteristic of addiction. Then we look at physical and psychological dependence. So physical dependence is when the body adapts to use, leading to tolerance, which we went over, and withdrawal symptoms. Psychological dependence is the emotional reliance on the substance to cope. So if we look at this through the lens of the disease model, addiction is a chronic relapsing medical condition characterized by compulsive substance use despite harmful consequences. It emphasizes that addiction is not a moral failing, but a result of brain structure and function changes caused by substance use. So when we look at addiction as a disease, and then we compare it to something like heart disease, okay? So let's look at both of these. If we look at addiction, there's a biological basis, right? So neurochemical changes in the brain drive compulsive behavior. We talked about the hijacking of the reward system, right? And how the brain actually changes with drug use. Well, when we look at heart disease, the body actually changes due to elements that cause decomposition of the heart, right? So there's physical changes. It's chronic. So with no ongoing management of addiction, there'll be periods of relapse and recovery. Even sometimes with treatment there is, right? Same with heart disease. Heart disease can get better, but it also will get worse if treatment is not done. Treatment oriented. So when we think of addiction, it's really important that we promote compassion and science-based care instead of punishment, which would be the same with heart disease, right? So if we look at the role of genetics and environment, in addiction, genetic predisposition and environmental factors play a role. It's the same with heart disease, right? We can get heart disease that runs in our family. So this is how you can compare addiction to another disease, which kind of makes it easier sometimes for people to understand. So this is the skill for this training. We're going to learn how to explain the disease model. I just kind of gave you an explanation back there, but we talked about what is the disease model, right? It's a chronic condition involving changes in the brain. Why is addiction a disease? Because it's characterized by biological changes in brain chemistry, genetic and environmental influences, and it's similar to other chronic disease like diabetes or hypertension. Why it's important to know this. Understanding this reduces the shame and stigma, encourages seeking help and ongoing management, and frames addiction as treatable with support and resources. So when we explain the addiction model or the disease model to people, we want to make sure that we use simple language, we're empathetic, we use analogies, and we invite questions. So I'm going to give you a real life example. Here's a scenario. So this is going to be about Linda, right? Let's start with the background. So the mobile crisis unit is dispatched to a rural home after a call from Linda, a 50-year-old woman who's concerned about her son, Eric, a 27-year-old who has been struggling with heroin addiction for several years. Linda explains that Eric has recently lost his job and his substance use has escalated. He's been isolating himself in his room, refusing to talk to her and showing signs of withdrawal when not using. Linda, frustrated and tearful, says, "He just needs to stop. I've told him over and over that if he loved me, he would quit, but he keeps choosing drugs. What am I doing wrong?" When the crisis team arrives, Eric is hesitant to engage. He says, "I know I'm a failure. I can't stop, and no one understands what I'm going through." So here's a little background on Linda and Eric. Let's look at some goals for the crisis team. So goal 1 would be to educate Linda on the disease model of addiction to reduce blame and stigma. Goal 2 would be to build rapport with Eric by explaining addiction as a chronic brain disease rather than a moral failing. And goal 3 would be develop a short-term stabilization plan and connect Eric to appropriate treatment resources. So let's talk about what it would look like to educate Linda. The team would listen to Linda's concerns and provide empathy. So here's what a team member might say. It's clear how much you care about Eric and want him to recover. Addiction is incredibly hard on families. They explain addiction as a disease model to shift her perspective. So the team member might say, addiction changes the way the brain works, especially in areas that control decision-making and cravings. It's not about a lack of love or willpower. It's a chronic condition that needs treatment, like diabetes or heart disease. They reassure Linda that her support is valuable. The team member might say something like, your role as his mother is essential, but recovery is a journey that often requires professional help and time. All right, now let's look at how we could engage Eric. The team uses the disease model to build rapport with Eric and reduce his feelings of shame. Team member, what you're going through isn't about being a failure. Addiction affects the brain in ways that make stopping incredibly hard. This is a medical issue, not a personal weakness. They encourage Eric to open up about his challenges. You might ask someone, what have you been feeling lately? What's the hardest part of trying to stop? This is how you kind of engage them and explore what's going on for them. And then you develop a plan. The team works with Eric and Linda to create a short-term stabilization plan. For Eric, Eric agrees to attend a telehealth session with an addiction counselor and explore medication-assisted treatment. This would be something like a methadone or Suboxone or Sublocade or Vivitrol. There's a lot of different medication-assisted treatments that are options. The team member might say something like, we can help connect you to a nearby MAT clinic and counseling services that specialize in addiction recovery. You're not alone in this. What has been found also, especially with MAT, is that having counseling along with addiction treatment really helps outcomes. For Linda, they recommend a local support group for families affected by addiction, something like Al-Anon. Emphasizing the importance of self-care, the team provides Narcan to Linda and explains its use in case of an overdose. Outcome, Linda feels more hopeful and less burdened by guilt after learning about the disease model of addiction. Eric is relieved to hear that his struggles are not a moral failing and agrees to take the first steps towards treatment. The family leaves the intervention with a clearer understanding of addiction and a plan to move forward. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about like a debrief of this. So how did the crisis team use the disease model to address Linda's frustrations? Well, they reframed addiction as a chronic brain disease to reduce stigma and blame. What strategies helped Eric feel less ashamed and more willing to engage? They emphasized that addiction is a medical condition, not a personal failure, and validated his struggles. Last, what role did the disease model play in creating a plan for Eric's recovery? It provided a framework for introducing professional treatment options such as MAT and counseling as essential steps toward managing his addiction. So key points about this training. Brain structure is altered by addiction. The brain's reward system is disrupted, leading to intense cravings and pleasure seeking. Last, the disease model. The use of it reduces stigma and emphasizes need for medical treatment. Thank you very much.